PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with David Rullo about his book, Gen X Pittsburgh, The Beehive and the 90s Scene.
This week on PA Books, David Rullo, author of Gen X Pittsburgh.
David Rullo is the author of Gen X Pittsburgh, The Beehive and the 90s Scene. Now, you say in the book that the Beehive changed your life. How?
So before the Beehive was created, there weren't a lot of places for kind of artsy kids to go to that sort of didn't fit in with the, so at college, like frat kind of culture. And the Beehive, at least in Pittsburgh, really helped to create a really artistic environment for people to be able to go into.
Now, the Beehive was a coffee house. Take us back to that time. Today, there are coffee houses everywhere.
Right.
Were they as common back in those days?
The Beehive was the first, and it was the first in an area that had been sort of decimated by the collapse of the steel industry. So there was a lot of cheap rent, there was a lot of unused buildings, and there were a lot of artsy kids living around the south side of Pittsburgh at the time who, when the Beehive was formed as the very first coffee house in the city, it really became a neighborhood place. It was the place for artists and ne'er-do-wells and denizens and circus freaks and all kinds of other people.
Well, take us back there. If we were sitting in there having a cup of coffee, what would we be surrounded by?
Yeah, the very first thing that you would notice is as soon as you opened the door, you were hit by a heavy cloud of smoke. This was 1992, and people weren't as concerned about nicotine as they are now. So you were hit with this huge cloud of smoke that hung high overhead. As you entered, the Beehive was packed with people from the time it opened to the time it closed every day, the south side location. So on the left-hand side, there are 3 or 4 tables. On the, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, there is the baristas that they called coffee slingers, and there's a case showing the different cheesecakes and desserts that they had available. They always had a large collection of desserts available. As you move further back, there's an open space with a couch, and then when you get a lot further into the back, there's a room that's just filled with pinball machines. And so every single table was filled with, this was the grunge era, so there was a lot of people in Doc Marten boots and flannel shirts and alternative T-shirts and pink hair and blue hair and tattoos, and immediately to the left of them were people standing waiting to get tables because there were so many people, there weren't enough tables. So people would stand waiting for anybody to get up so they could jump onto the tables. Next to the tables were standing ashtrays that were overflowing. There were people playing Magic or card games or chess. There were, every wall was painted in really deep primary colors, and they had art surrounding the walls. On the walls, there were murals by Pittsburgh artists. It was, as much as it was a coffee house, it was completely filled with art. So you had this really rich aroma of coffee and nicotine, but you also had this sort of underlying current of people who were participating in art and collaborating with art. This was before the internet, so one table would be talking to somebody else on the table, 3 doors up about a film they were going to do together or about an album they were recording. And it was just a very community-oriented space.
Talk more about that sense of community. Was that something that was intentionally cultivated by the coffee shop?
I think so. Even if it was created by happenstance. So before they opened, when Scott and Steve, the two owners, were thinking about what kind of art they would have on the walls and things like that, they just put a sign up that said "Artist Wanted," and the next day there was a line around the building of people waiting to be able to go in and show their art and create art there. So right away, this community was starting to develop of different artists. And not just artists, but a few blocks down from the Beehive is the City Theater. So people that were going there each night to the City Theater to see whatever show they had going on, they would go to the Beehive. People during the day would come in as they were going to work. People who were ending their nights or beginning their nights, really. So they would start at the Beehive and then go to other bars and then come back to the Beehive because they weren't serving coffee, but they were open at least Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 24 hours a day. So you could begin and end your night at the Beehive. There was a real sense of community. Now, the one sense of community that probably took longer to develop than others was the actual neighborhood community, meaning that people who were art students, people that were musicians, people that were authors were all hanging out there. But the people that lived in the neighborhood were a little distrustful of this new establishment. Not only was this new, but the kind of people that were hanging out there were new. One of the people in the book says that the blue-haired ladies, old ladies, didn't like the pink-haired young girls that were hanging out at the Beehive. And it sort of took some time to develop that trust between them.
Now, you mentioned the two co-owners, Scott Kramer and Steve Zumoff. Yep. Who were they, and how did they get into this?
Yeah, Scott and Steve were two people that had recently graduated from Pitt. And Scott had owned many different businesses. He was an entrepreneur from the time he was old enough to go and sell frozen ice at Forbes Field in Oakland, and developed a landscaping business and then a tie-dye business that was actually very, very successful, but had to be shut down because the FTC found out that the ink he was using was carcinogenic. So this fabulous business that he had to be shut down, and so he was looking for the next thing. And he had talked to one of the distributors he had for the shirts in New York, who said, there's this thing happening across the country I'm seeing, and it's coffee houses. And you should really look into it. So Scott and Steve decided to go see the Grateful Dead in California. And they thought that on their way there, they would stop in different cities and see if there were coffee houses. And so they stopped in Chicago, where they saw, the second Starbucks outside of Seattle. Along the way, they just saw these different coffee houses, and they thought this was a viable option for them to explore. So they got back to Pittsburgh. They went to Toronto. Toronto had a lot of the sort of bright primary colors that were in the Beehive were taken from different places they saw in Toronto. There was a place called the Beehive, but it was a bar in Toronto, but they thought that name was good enough as any, so they turned it into a coffee house.
Once they decided to do this, what did they do? They had no background in this, so
right.
What were their first steps?
Right. Remarkably, they hadn't even had like a cappuccino before they decided to do this. And so they got the idea when they were at Starbucks. They picked up, the idea of coffee houses were so new to the average person that wasn't hanging out in like a little Italy section of town where you could get, glasses of espresso or cups of espresso, but that was it. So Starbucks was educating their consumer. So they had these little pamphlets that told you about the drinks, what they were, and how they were made. And so they took that pamphlet with them, and they decided this would be the way they would make their coffee. They were lucky enough that they met one of the managers at a Starbucks who moved to Pittsburgh, and she was able to help them borrow some of the drinks from the Starbucks menu and make it into, the first sort of cappuccino or espresso-based drinks that people have had in Pittsburgh.
So once they opened, who were their employees?
Their employees were very much the people that were their customers. They were a mix of artists and neighborhood people. There were a lot of people from the Art Institute. There were a lot of people from Pitt and from filmmakers and just kind of general people that had been hanging out in the neighborhood looking for something to do. There was this sort of very ill-defined wall between customer and employee, especially when you get beyond the coffee slingers and you get into the janitors. The janitors were a point of distinction for many people in the city, but they weren't necessarily great at cleaning. They were great at partying and being part of the Beehive scene. So at any point, they might have 3 or 4 different janitors, but I'm not sure you would know it.
What was it that drew them to the South Side?
Yeah, the South Side had cheap rent. They had looked in Oakland. They eventually did open a second location in Oakland, which, if you're not familiar with the city, is sort of the university part of Pittsburgh. It's where the University of Pittsburgh and CMU and Chatham University is, and they also have a whole lot of hospitals there. So they thought that would be where they would start. But they couldn't find a place to rent. So when Scott was thinking about different things to do with his life, he thought at one point, maybe I'll buy real estate. Maybe that'll be what I do. So he toured the South Side and just kept it in the back of his head. So when they were looking for places, they were able to find a place on the South Side that was a former pharmacy that was available, and so they rented it. And just to give you an idea, if you're not familiar with Pittsburgh, there's downtown Pittsburgh, which in 1992 was skyscrapers and office buildings and not much more. I mean, there weren't restaurants, there weren't after-hour locations, there was no nightlife. It was very hard. There were 2 or 3 different places to see some different plays and things like that, but that's about it. I went to college at Point Park College. It was downtown, and the only thing available at the time was like a Rax and a Subway. That was it. And so you crossed a bridge and you went over to the south side of the city, which like I said, had really suffered because of the collapse of the steel mills, and so there was a lot of available space. There was a lot of opportunity for artists and for entrepreneurs, and that's what you found kind of mixed together.
Now, the Beehive had a distinctive logo. What were the origins of that?
Yeah, there were 2 guys, Michael and Rick, who are artists who had started a graphic arts company, and they had a whole bunch of like 1940s magazines that they were going through, and one of them saw the Beehive haircut and cut it out. This was still, this was not computers. Everything was done by hand. So they actually cut out the Beehive, put it down, drew the picture of the face, and that's where that came from.
And that would have a long life throughout the course of the
all
cafe.
30 years or 28 years it lasted, and it's been on T-shirts and on coffee labels and on stickers and postcards and anything else you could think of. It was there.
So were Scott and Steve surprised by the success?
I think they were. I think that, as Scott told me, the first day when they opened up and there was literally a line around the block, he thought to himself, we got to open a second one of these. And he said, so we opened the Oakland location, and it was about, I think he said it's 3 times the size, and the idea would be that if it was 3 times the size, they would make 3 times the profits. And he said, and that never happened, right? It's much harder to replicate the success. This was so organic. I don't think you could have expected what happened in the Beehive. It was a one-time thing that was replicated a few times in the South Side with some of the other businesses that opened over the next decade or so. Rob, really, when I think of the golden age of these Generation X sort of businesses, it was 1991 to 1996, and some things happened in 96 that sort of changed the business climate that didn't make it as attractive, I think, in the South Side anymore for entrepreneurs.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that generational aspect, because it's right in your title, Gen X Pittsburgh. Talk about Generation X and what was unique about that generation that really tied into what made the Beehive special.
Yeah, so it was my generation, right? And I think that's what, for me, that's what made it most special. But there was this sort of weird nexus of 1970s and 80s culture had sort of died away, collapsed in Pittsburgh. And again, it goes back to the steel mills and to the other associated industries that were around it. So all of these things were sort of falling apart, and these new kids were coming up who were much more artistic than their parents. They were, if not first generation, definitely at the most second generation, like college kids or art students. And they were experimenting with all these different avenues in art that hadn't been done before. I interviewed somebody who talked about the fact that because no one had ever taken apart a steel mill, no one knew how to do it, right? So he could just walk in and take pieces of the steel mill and go back and weld with them, which was something that, now that's horrifying, right? Could you imagine your kid going into a steel mill and just taking pieces of it? So that was part of Gen X. There was still this sort of, at least for me anyways, this sort of fear of nuclear war, right? You still had Russia as a very real threat, and so a lot of the art that was created was influenced by that. But as much as this was a Pittsburgh thing, it was also a Seattle thing, and an Austin thing, and a New York thing. And without the internet and without cell phones, there was this culture that developed of young kids that sort of all dressed the same. They were all listening to the same alternative music bands. They were reading Jack Kerouac and Douglas Copeland, and wearing ripped up jeans, an old shirt they got at the Salvation Army, and Doc Martens. It was just a very, very different generation, I think, from the previous ones.
And were those the people who were really attracted to the Beehive, or did it appeal to multiple generations? It
was primarily Gen X, but there was an undercurrent of people there from all walks of life. There were a few people. There was an artist who had really been on the South Side when it was a sort of before it had found its identity, and so they were like squatting in buildings to to create their art. And so if he was a generation prior, he was in his 30s. There were people in their 40s who would age at the Beehive. So those people who were 40, were 70 by the time it closed and still went there. There were, like I said, people that were going to the City Theater who were in their 50s and 60s at the time, who found something fascinating about not just the ability to go have a coffee, a cappuccino, which they hadn't done before, but this group of kids, who didn't necessarily look like their kids. Because a lot of the kids in the surrounding communities, if you were in the suburbs, you're a little slower to adapt to some of these changes maybe. So they're kids who weren't sort of like this first generation of alternative kids, but were maybe closer to our age, obviously. They still didn't look like that. So they were catching this scene and coming the entire time. So it was primarily young kids, but everybody went to the Beehive.
So one of the artists in the community at that time was Kevin Schlosser, who painted a mural on the back of the cafe that was significant there. Describe the mural, tell us who he was.
Yeah, I can't tell you much about him because the funny thing is when you write a book and you you reach out to a lot of people for a lot of interviews. I interviewed over 70 people, some multiple times, and that's a fair amount for a book of 50,000 words. But some of the people get back to you, some of them don't, some of them have moved away, especially sort of in this culture where it's sort of a little bit of anti-technology. It can be hard to get to people. So Kevin was one who last week actually wrote me back and said, hey, I just got your message. Would love to talk to you. I know that you finished the book, but if there's anything else going on. So I only know him through the stories that Scott and Steve would tell. But he painted a very large cappuccino cup that was in the back of the wall of the Beehive. And if you look at a show like Friends, that really sort of grabbed onto this emerging coffeehouse scene and based a television show around it. It has the same, it's not the same artist, but the coffee cups look very, very similar to what Kevin had done in the Beehive.
And you say that it was that was so significant that when it closed down, they actually removed it and took it with them.
They did, and in fact, just so that people are aware, a lot of these things are actually kept at the Heinz History Center. The Beehive, they have the Beehive archive there. And so these things are so significant to the city that the Heinz History Center, which you normally think of as, you know, Mr. Rogers and the steel mills and Carnegie, you know, and there's the Beehive stuff. So it was so significant that it is there as part of that archive.
Now, as you've been talking about this, you mentioned the artist, but design in general seems to have been significant as part of the kind of the feel, the vibe for the place. Talk about how they thought about that. You know, where did they get the furniture, and how did they think about that style?
You know, Scott was very, very visionary in his thinking. He wanted the Beehive to look like if you went into your grandmother's or your aunt's attic, and there was just all this furniture there, right? And nothing really matched because it had been in the attic. So there's a table, but none of the chairs are from that set. And there are different coffee cups that don't go together. So that was the idea. And Scott and Steve were able to find these things both at the thrift stores that were located in the South Side. There were 2 or 3 of them, but also at the University of Pittsburgh. They were selling. Every semester, I guess, they get rid of a bunch of stuff and they sell it cheap or they throw it out and you're able to go and take it. And that's where they got a lot of the furniture from.
Now, Scott and Steve, were they actively involved in running it, or were they more of distant managers? What was their role?
No, they were, in fact, they were active as part of the scene as well. Scott was sort of the idea man. Steve was the guy that would figure out how to take Scott's really crazy ideas and put them into practice, or the people behind the counter as well. When Marla first started as the first manager of the Beehive, she said, I got there and Scott just had this notebook of ideas and he just handed it to me. And she said, and some of them were like really crazy, like he just had cats written down. And I didn't know what that meant, and then I asked him, and he said, I don't know. I just thought it'd be kind of cool to have cats incorporated in here somehow. And so as I'm talking to Scott, I asked him, I said, you know, Marla told me a story. Does that sound right? And he went, yeah, that really does sound like something I would have done. I just had this idea for cats. So they were very hands-on, but they were also friends with many of the people that were everyday customers of the Beehive, and they were going to parties at night with them, and they were, you know, inviting them back to the Beehive after hours for parties, or they were going to concerts and movies together, or raves when they had raves at the Oakland location. So they were as involved as you could get, so far that they crossed that line, that the third wall, right, or the fourth wall, into being a customer as well.
Now, how did they train their employees? Since coffee was still fairly new and they had to educate their customers,
right,
they also had to educate their employees.
Yeah, and you know, the funny thing is, for as lackadaisical as it may seem like they were very specific about training. There was a book about coffee that they had found, and I think Marla might have mentioned it to them. And so they bought copies, and they made every person who was an employee read the book. They had to be able to identify different types of coffee and talk about, why something was a dark brew and not a light brew. They were very, very specific about things like pizza bagels and how do you cut pizza bagels, and what were in their sandwiches. They were this was not the sort of laid back hippie kind of job training that you would expect a place like this to have.
Now, you mentioned all the people that you interviewed. When you interviewed them, did they have a sense of excitement for those days? Was the Beehive still significant for them as a memory?
Yeah, I think every single person that I spoke with was very excited about it. I would say probably for most people, your college years are sort of like those golden years, right? And for these people, those golden years, certainly for me, they lasted a little bit longer than they probably should have, right? So 91 to 96, 5, 6 years, 7 years. But they were really exciting because they were places where not only were they going to meet friends and to hang out and get cheap coffee and be a part of a scene, but they were also the place where they were able to establish their career. Everybody thinks about that first place they worked at as kind of special. But for these guys who were artists who maybe didn't have an office, this was where they were going every day to create art. And that was really exciting for them. They were really happy to talk about that. And other people were really excited to talk about how when you were behind the counter of the Beehive, you were almost like a local celebrity. And so they were excited to relive those days and tell the stories of what it was like to, have people who only wanted to come when they were behind, slinging coffee and those sort of things. It was very exciting for everybody, I think.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
So when they decided to move their second operation in Oakland, how did the differences in the neighborhoods create a different culture around the coffee houses?
Yes, there's a big difference between the South Side and Oakland. The South Side is a neighborhood. Before the Beehive got there in '91, it was a community that supported itself, a neighborhood that supported itself. So all of the businesses that were there were for the neighborhood. If you needed a drugstore, the drugstore was there. A hardware store was there. In Oakland, it was a college and hospital town. So most, not all, certainly now, definitely, but a lot of the businesses were there for college kids or for the professors who were there. It was much more transient. And for the hospitals, there were things like where you could go and grab a quick bite to eat, but not necessarily places where people would linger, because that was one of the places that Scott and Steve thought they would draw a large community from, was the hospital workers who after a shift would show up at the coffee house. But they said it turns out that after you've worked a 10-hour shift at a hospital, you maybe don't want to hang out in the same place and get coffee and drink all night, right? You want to go home and cook dinner and go to sleep before your next 10-hour shift. So it became a much more transient community at the Beehive in Oakland. The other thing that differed that location from the one in the South Side was that there was a movie theater there. So you had people who were just coming to see movies. You had people that were there upstairs. They had a pinball room. And while pinball was huge at both locations, having a dedicated pinball room that was designed architecturally for pinball really meant something to the people. So you had people coming there to play pinball. You didn't necessarily have this sort of coffee culture. I mean, there were some people coming for coffee, but that wasn't the primary draw of the Oakland Beehive, probably.
Was it still an artist center?
It was, but not as much, because not as many artists lived in Oakland. A lot of Oakland's housing stock was being used for University of Pittsburgh students. So you didn't, and the University of Pittsburgh, while a college, wasn't like the South Side with a lot of art students. The advantage the South Side had was that the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, I think filmmakers at the time had a bunch of students that were living at Point Park. Point Park College, which was a dance primarily a dance, theater, and journalism school. So you had all kinds of people being writers and dancing and actors. So you had this whole artistic crowd to draw from. And in Oakland, you have CMU students who are engineering and are robotics, and that's the type of student you were getting there. Not that they don't have a great theater department, because they do. I don't want anybody to write me letters. I know that they have a great theater department. But Pitt itself, is this huge multi-discipline college where people are coming for all kinds of different things. So it didn't have the strictly art community there.
How important was music to the scene around these cafes?
I mean, it was probably one of the biggest things for the scene that developed. It wasn't just the national scene, which, if you remember, in 1992, there was the first traveling Lollapalooza show that was here, and alternative music had really started to come into its own as a genre that was being programmed by radio. But the local bands were using the Beehive as a place to go have meetings or to play. So a band like Rusted Root, which, in Pittsburgh was a local band, but even across the state or nationally, was a different thing, right? They're not a local band, but they started out with their meetings at the Beehive, and they sold cassette tapes at the Beehive and played at the Beehive in Oakland. And a lot of the musicians, when they came to town, would stop at the Beehive. So bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers would go and hang out there until they were noticed, and then they would leave. There were a lot of actors and writers and who would also come by. John Cusack, I know, had been there. There's a large portion of different disciplines of art, that people who would show up.
They also talk about Blue Duck Records.
Yeah, that's right. Blue Duck Records was Pittsburgh's answer to Sub Pop Records, which was the label in Seattle that Nirvana and Soundgarden and Mudhoney and a few other really big bands in the grunge era got their start to. So Blue Duck was a label that Rusted Root was first signed to, and then a whole crop of other Pittsburgh bands like the Nixon Clocks and Liz Berlin, when she did things on her own. I mean, there was just probably 10 or 12 bands that were on the Blue Duck record label, but they had these really influential sampler discs called Blue Ducks 1, 2, and then Blue Swan, which was all sort of, or mostly female-driven, acoustic kind of coffee house music. So they developed that at the time.
Now, one of the unique figures that you mentioned is Chuck Austin. You said he was 80 years old, so he was a little bit of a different generation than what was hanging out there. How did he fit into the community?
Yeah, he said, so he was a musician, and he was a musician that played, in the beginning, blues and bluegrass and Americana, but he loved the Beehive, he loved the people, and he loved the environment of being able to meet up with different musicians and create these pickup bands that would hang out outside of the Beehive and play. If you think about like the buskers that maybe have a cup for some change, that's the kind of bands these were. But these were also bands that there ended up being an event called the Southside Street Spectacular. It's like any other art or community festival that neighborhoods have, and they ended up playing it at these places, on a regular basis. Chuck is a preacher from North Versailles, which is a small town outside of Pittsburgh, and so if that was his day job, at night, every night, he's playing bluegrass music and really, sort of odd banjo music and things like that with other guys he met at the Beehive. But all of those guys were in their 20s, right? And they still talk about what Chuck brought to their life. This sort of, on the one hand, discipline, the discipline of, if we're going to make music, we're going to make music, but also this sort of enthusiasm for what you're doing.
So we talked about the state of the South Side with the closing of the steel mills at the time that the Beehive was founded. Over the following years, did the presence of the Beehive change the business community on that main street?
Yeah, the entire South Side changed 2 or 3 times over the course of the Beehive's life. It started as a home for really alternative and artistic sort of location. So the Beehive was next to a place that I always compare it to. If you remember the story of the Sex Pistols, it came out of this shop called, I think it was called Sex, in London. There was a fashion store where they were selling like punk fashion clothing, and so that's sort of what Slacker was. It was the first place where you could go that wasn't an Army Navy store and buy Doc Marten boots. And across the street there was a place called Groovy that was it was nostalgia for Generation X, right? So you could go in there and get $6 Million Man figures and A-Team cards and Brady Bunch lunch boxes, right? And that started to happen the whole way down East Carson. So it started on one block and it worked its way up, and slowly most of the sort of bars and restaurants which were catering to the steel mill community changed to support this community. And then over the years, it became more of originally a night spot, which was still owned by mostly individual landlords. So, you have local landlords who are owning local property and trying to do things that, even if it's not necessarily just within the mind of the neighborhood, it's the region that they're thinking of. So Pittsburgh in general, right, and what's going to work there, and that lasted for a while, and then the last is sort of where we are now, is that a lot of there's still some obviously local people who are owning places, but it's also become this sort of spot where out-of-town landlords own really big malls and or a really big mall, I should say, and other locations like the kind of restaurants that you see in any other suburb, right? Or maybe every suburb. So like a Raising Cane, I'm not sure if Raising Cane's there, but those sort of places where all of a sudden is what's in the South Side now. And that's brought a real change. It's no longer like South Side kids or kids from the city who are coming for this sort of arts experience now. Now it's transactional, completely transactional.
And did you start to see more people from outside the community coming in as it became more successful?
Yeah, I think that now it's almost exclusively people from outside of the community. And so when I say outside the community, that might mean 10 minutes down the road, or it might mean an hour away. But if you go to East Carson Street, which is the main thoroughfare on the South Side, on a Friday or Saturday night now, it's a completely different type of crowd than it was when it was local kids that were hanging out and cared about the community because they lived there, because their mother lived there. You know what I mean? Because their uncle had lived there, and so they came to the South Side when they came to school because their uncle had told them about this community. You don't have that anymore. You don't have people who are genuinely concerned about the businesses, and you don't have the business owners that are really concerned about the people either.
Now, we talked about some of the paintings and the visual side of things and the music, but there were also art performances. What kinds of performances would we have seen?
Yeah, performance art is, and I would say in 1992, performance art was still, we're still figuring out what performance art meant, right? So if in the 40s and 50s, and you're talking about minimalistic music, and no one really sure what that means in New York, so people are kind of renting loft spaces to play their music. That's sort of what was happening on the South Side. There were a couple of art collectives. The Bull Seal Collective was one of them, where they were just doing odd projects, right? Almost confrontational, not quite, but they was really trying to challenge the idea of performance. There was a circus, and that was almost art. So they were doing things like sewing their mouths shut, which became popular with the Jim Rose sideshow circus, but hadn't been seen in Pittsburgh, at least on this sort of scale before the Circus Apocalypse was the name of it, was doing at the time. It was really outrageous kind of stuff, the kind of stuff that maybe you read about if you read a book about like carny folk, but certainly wasn't happening in the city in 1990 at that point.
Talk more about that, because you talk about Dave Apocalypse.
Yeah.
And people thought that was his last name. Who was he, and how did he get involved in this scene?
Yeah, he was a local guy whose father had sort of been a half con man, half, as I guess was kind of popular, kind of indicative of a lot of these people in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right? And so he sort of learned the craft from his father, but he was a clown who decided to put together a circus. And he said, one of the things you do when you put together a circus is you don't do the stupid stuff, you find other guys to do the stupid stuff. So he found a group of people to do things like sew their lips shut, or eat bugs, or belly dance and swallow fire. And while all of these things sound kind of maybe run-of-the-mill at this point, they certainly weren't in 1990, and they certainly weren't in the area bars where they were going inside. You don't see many people swallowing fire back then, but as Dave says, he probably had the fire regulations changed in Pittsburgh because he used to do that, because no one had said you couldn't do that back then. So it was just something that was happening.
Now, in the book, you also include a photograph of former Vice President Al Gore drinking coffee out of a Beehive mug. How did that happen?
Yeah, so there were two large daily papers in the city at the time. One of them was on strike, but their employees were required to be at, and it was the Pittsburgh Press. They were required to get paid because they were still getting funding from the union. They had to at least show up, and so they would show up, and then they would go to the Beehive and have coffee. And one of the women who was a photographer for the Post ended up being Al Gore's official photographer and did photography for Barack Obama as well. So when Al Gore was coming to town, he said, I'm going to stop at that place, the O, which is it's closed now, but it was a semi-famous local joint that served hot dogs. And she said, oh, forget the O. You've got to go to the Beehive. And he said, I don't know if I have time to do that. And she said, at the very least, you have to drink from one of the mugs. And so he drank from one of the mugs, and she took the photo.
Now, I guess Scott and Steve were trying to always find interesting things to do at these cafes. So one of them was ramen noodle wrestling. So
there is a local Pittsburgh artist, musician named Fat Man D. And that sort of came out of Fat Man D's mind, her and another man named Mark. Scott and Steve let Fat Man D do what she wanted in terms of programming. And she came up with this idea of ramen noodle wrestling, which only sounds odd if you weren't there on a regular basis. But they filled an inflatable pool, and it was outside, and they filled it with ramen noodles, and people wrestled in it. It's exactly what it sounds like it is. But Fat Man D is a local legend on the South Side. Her wedding was the same day as one of the Summer Street Spectaculars, and so she got married like in a parade going down East Carson Street that stopped in front of the Beehive. It was cataloged and for nostalgia and for memory forever. In the papers, they came down and did stories about it. She's married to a guy named Tommy Amoeba, who kind of looks like, I forget the guy's name, Wavy Gravy, right, from Woodstock. Yeah, so I mean, that was Fat Man D.
You mentioned that Oakland, there was a movie theater there. Yeah. What types of movies did it show?
It was almost exclusively cult and underground films, and that's because there were other chains in the city that had said, if you're going to allow them to have first-run movies, we aren't going to show them in our theaters. So Scott and Steve had to pivot and figure out what they could do to get a crowd in this space that they had a movie theater for. And so they played Clerks, and they played Kids, and they did the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Those were the types of films that they played a lot of. As Steve told me, they were a lot of film, and they're Gen X films, right? But they were a lot of films that the other theaters didn't want because there was so much talking in them. And if you remember, at this time, it's Terminator 2, and it's whatever else are the big action films, and they're showing films where people are sitting inside of a convenience store doing nothing but talking for 2 hours. So.
Now, one of the projectionists there was Mark Choi. Who was he? What was his role in the community?
Yeah, Mark had an interesting background. Mark had run a club with another guy named Manny Tyner, who continues today to be an underground promoter, so underground experimental music. But Mark, he and Mark owned a club called the Sonic Temple. And that was famous because it was the club Nirvana came to play before they had broke. And they actually stayed at Mark and Manny's apartment they shared at the time. It was Mark's birthday, so that made it even more special, in a year when Nirvana became what they became. But Mark was really just a guy who, because he'd owned this club, they hired to run the projection equipment, and projection equipment that old caused problems, and so he would have to learn how to, edit films together fairly quickly while they were filming, and he would have to learn how to, if one projector was breaking down, you grab another one. Like, these are all skill sets that he had to come up with. And how do you sell tickets? I mean, Mark was really essential, I think, in the early days for running this theater.
Now, you tell the story about Mike Saxman and how they wanted him to make a marble top
that's right.
table or bar area, but he didn't quite hear it the way that they said.
That's right. I think Scott had in his mind these very elegant sort of Roman-looking marble top tables and bar, and what Mark heard was marble. And so he created these tables that had plexiglass, and they were filled with marbles. So, but those were the happy experiments that happened at the Beehive and worked out pretty well for them.
Now, you also talk about, and you mentioned it earlier, about the pinball machines.
Yeah.
That seemed to take off a bit during that time period.
Yeah, it's not a lie to say that Scott Zumoff was directly responsible with some other people, some other partners, for the resurgence of pinball, definitely in Pittsburgh, probably the Northeast. He liked pinball as a kid, and he said, if I'm going to own a place, it's going to be a place I want to hang out, which means it has to have a pinball machine in it. So originally they put one game in, and that game was always occupied. And so they decided to put a second game in, and they opened up a back room, and they put 3 or 4, I think at one point there were as many as 7 games in the back room. And people were playing all the time. And the next year they opened the Oakland location, and Steve decided he wanted to bring games in there. And so they had an architect build a room that was soundproof, so you wouldn't have to hear the pinball, if you were in the neighboring buildings or downstairs, or if you were in the next room where bands were playing. And it became, so first of all, in Pittsburgh, it became such a big thing that he became such good friends with the pinball distributor that distributor trusted him enough that he would say, here's a set of keys. Go ahead and just take the money out, and we'll, you'll split it for me, and I trust you that you'll be honest about it. But as things are going on in Manhattan, there's Broadway Arcade. The guy that had owned that had a pinball league, and Steve and one of his partners bought it off of him, brought it to Pittsburgh. They opened it up. First, they had a pinball tournament at the Beehive it filled the place. They couldn't fit any more people, so they decided they needed another location. They rented a room at a hotel about 5 miles away. That sold out, so the next year they bought their own building, and they filled that building every year until there was flooding that damaged the building. They had to find another location. So they finally went to the convention center in Pittsburgh, which is used to having home shows and car shows and these really massive sort of shows drawing thousands of people from across the country. And it became so big there that it was the third largest convention every year outside of the car show and the home show. Pinball probably would have died away with the advent of digital games, at least in Pittsburgh, but not for Steve. And now I can tell you there are 3, 4, 5 different locations in Pittsburgh, and there's, the game was invented in Chicago, so there's dozens of places in Chicago, but New York has places, and Charlotte has places, and you can't go anywhere now without seeing pinball. But nobody really speaks of the legacy of Steve with that, which was really important.
Now, there was also the Black Sheep Puppet Festival.
Yeah.
How did that work out?
Yeah, that was if the Beehive was on East Carson Street, a few roads up, there was a place that was a former brew house. It's called the Brew House Space. And it was originally a place where artists just kind of took over, and eventually was organized into a commune's not the right word, but let's just say a building that was primarily artist studios and residential lofts for artists. And one of the people who lived there, his name was Rob Long, with a couple of other people, came up with this puppet festival that was in Pittsburgh every year, that was really artistic and adult themed and intelligent puppet theater that was really popular and would probably be around today, but not for COVID.
Now, the early life in the 90s of this cafe was pre-internet, and then, of course, the internet starts coming in more as you get towards the latter half of the 90s. At some point, they become an internet cafe, and they're renting internet time. Describe that time period and how that happened. Yeah,
and so the first thing I want to say about that is that I think Scott and Steve were ahead of the curve in one other aspect of technology, which was hiring women. The women they hired a couple of women to sort of help wire the place to become internet capable. And at this point, the business was really male dominated, and I think they made a choice to make sure that they were hiring a woman. And in fact, when other places around town, or in the blocks, I should say, around the Beehive, needed to update their systems because all of a sudden internet checks were coming in and things like that, they recommended the women that had worked for them, and some of these places weren't necessarily on board with that because they were used to this sort of male culture. So I give Scott and Steve a lot of credit for that as well. But the internet, like everyone else, I think they could sort of see what was on the horizon, that people were starting to spend a lot more time on their laptops, and they need to figure out how to one, modernize what was happening at the Beehive, but two, monetize this new trend. And so they used to sell cards. You could buy internet service for X number of minutes based on the card you bought, which was really kind of cutting edge at the time. And there were a few other places that jumped on the wagon because they saw it at the Beehive, but ultimately it didn't last, and they went out of business. The Beehive was able to keep it going for a while.
How did the emergence of the internet affect the community side of the Beehive?
Yeah, I think if you talk to almost every person, almost every interview I did, they all say the Beehive happened because there was no internet, because there was no cell phone, right? And so you were forced to interact with the people who were there. You couldn't look down at a computer screen. And once that started to happen, community started to go away, or at least change from what it was. To give you an example, I was interviewing somebody at a coffee house for the Beehive book, and we're talking probably at a lower decibel than you and I are discussing. And this woman who was sitting next to me took off her headphones and she said, "Can you guys please just like keep it down? I'm trying to study here, and it's really distracting." So that never would have happened to Beehive. There was always a decibel level that was, fairly loud because people were always talking. They were always talking to the tables next to them, or to the customer over here, or screaming to the coffee slinger to get another cup of coffee. It completely changed what was happening inside the building.
Now, in the book, you say that the 90s ended on 9/11. How did that affect this culture and this community?
Yeah, so I actually thought, I didn't think it ended then, but the person who owns Slacker made it pretty clear to me that it did, and he said that was because of the additional powers that were granted to the federal government after 9/11. The Attorney General at the time had wanted to make some fairly big drug busts to show that the war on drugs was working, and so Cheech from the comedy team, Chong from the comedy team, Cheech and Chong, had a business where he was selling drug paraphernalia, and Randy at Slacker had been buying it and selling it, and so the FBI decided that they were going to shut this down, and they used Pittsburgh because it was interstate commerce, so this is a federal crime. You have to have some way to link it back to the Constitution. That was, they were buying product in California that was being shipped to Pittsburgh, so it made sense that that was now an interstate crime. So they busted 3 or 4 different places that had been selling these marijuana pipes, and that's when things started to change, right? So Randy had to defend himself, had to pay for lawyers, had to sell Slacker, right? There was a place in Oakland called Teleropa that had to start tightening its belt because it had been busted. And so all of a sudden, all these places that had been so free and without regulation were now coming under the thumb of the federal government.
Now, eventually the Beehive would close down. We only have just a few minutes left, but can you talk about the last days or the ending of that?
You know, what was heartwarming about that, by the time I got out of college, I was production director for a radio station. I started in 1996, and my ability to go hang out at a coffee house all day or all night had diminished, right? And that happened for most people. But when they announced they were closing, the place was filled. They announced in October that they were going to close, and they didn't say a date. They just thought they would see what happened. But it was so busy every night that it went on until, I think, January or February. February is when it finally closed. People kept going back to it and going back to it. And they had nights where they had former coffee slingers come back and do coffee. They had people come and record for the archives of the Heinz History Center. This was a really big deal for the city. The city really embraced the coffee house again.
We've been talking about the book Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive, and the 90s scene. David Rullo, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.